Welcome to another edition of Eye on the Issues. Today, we're going to be talking energy. We're going to talk to Kenny Stein. He is the Vice President for Policy for the Institute for Energy Research. Kenny, thanks for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Kenny, let's begin by talking about, I guess it's called the Save Our Cars Coalition. You've got, the electric vehicles that are out there right now, and the government, of course, is moving in the direction of trying to mandate those. But, this is America. This is where people get to make their own choices. So, can you give me a little bit of insight into the reaction that Americans are facing when it comes to the idea that they may have to get away from their old gas guzzler in 15 or 20 years, or maybe even less?
Sure, and it's not just the old gas guzzlers; it's the new gas sippers too. They don't want anything that use liquid fuels, and it's an ideological project from folks frankly in San Francisco and Washington D.C. that think they know better how to run people's lives, and so electric vehicles are a useful product for certain niches, for certain people. If you're a suburbanite who has your own garage and you have a reliable commute every day, yeah, an electric vehicle might work for you. But if you got to drive a long way for work, if you live in a rural area, if you travel, when you go on road trips, they're just not very practical for everything that Americans want to use a personal vehicle for. And that's why, you've seen individuals have not been wanting to buy as many electric vehicles as the government is ordering car makers to produce. Things are coming to a head at this point. The early on, the lower percent, electric vehicles, depending on how you define electric, they're about 8 or 9% of sales from last year. And so they're in that first adoption phase, there were plenty of people that wanted those vehicles, but frankly, the people who wanted an electric vehicle largely already have one. And so we're now getting to the point where the government is continuing to mandate more electric vehicles and ban, and some states are even banning internal combustion vehicles. But people don't want to buy them. So you have dealers with electric vehicles piling up on the lot that can't get rid of them, but the government is requiring them to be sold. There's a fundamental problem here.
One question I have is, if for states like Wyoming, or the Wyoming Liberty Institute, obviously, Montana, Colorado, Utah, I mean, these are states that there's a lot of area between many of the cities, many of the towns. The whole concept of an electric vehicle in big states like these, it's kind of a challenge, I would imagine, especially because I've dealt with these electric vehicles before, and I know what it's like to wait in line to have to charge before you can go another couple hours. So I guess the question I have is, the freedom of America and what we're all about, it just seems like what the government's trying to do is not sitting well with many Americans. However, I will say this. When gas prices were real high, a couple, maybe what, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, or whatever, I mean, they've come down a little bit, but they're not back where they were when Donald Trump left office. But when gas prices were real high, it seemed like everybody wanted an electric vehicle. Am I right?
Yeah, well, and that was the big pitch too, is that they were going to save money. It was actually going to be it's ultimately beneficial for the economy, for the individual. And one that calculation is leaving a lot of things out. You talk about charging infrastructure a little bit. Someone's got to pay for the charging infrastructure. Also, charging an electric vehicle at home at residential electricity rates might be pretty cheap, but if you have to go to a fast charger when you're out on the road, that's more expensive. Somebody's got to pay for that infrastructure. So the cost benefit proposition there is questionable, to say the least. And if you don't have super high gas prices, which, given that we're the world's energy superpower now, you sort of looking off into the future, you don't see super high gas prices coming because we can produce much more of our own oil. Without high gas prices, the pocketbook trade-off really isn't super there, especially because electric vehicles upfront cost much more than an internal combustion engine vehicle does. So over the lifetime and use of the car, it's frankly, it's unlikely that a lot of people are going to actually see anything resembling a significant benefit, even if they do switch.
So what kind of rights or freedoms do Americans have as you have the federal government trying to push the electric vehicles on us? I mean, if Kamala Harris wins the presidency and they keep moving in the same direction when it comes to renewables and electric vehicles, are we going to be stuck having to possibly buy an electric vehicle in 10 or 15 years?
So here's the thing. The federal government does not have the power to ban any type of electric vehicle or to order you to purchase a particular type of vehicle. Now, Kamala Harris certainly would like that power and would like Congress to pass such a law, but it doesn't exist today. So what they've been doing so far is basically through the back door, they're trying to force the issue. It's one with mandates on automakers requiring them to manufacture electric vehicles, even if there's no one to buy them, which I was just talking about. And then on the other side, they're doing everything they can to make internal combustion engine vehicles much more expensive. And that's with tailpipe emission standards, safety standards, the CAFE standard, the corporate average fuel economy, the fuel efficiency standards that have been around since the 70s. That's their weapon to try and drive up the cost of internal combustion engine vehicles. And they hope that that combination of jacking up the price of ICE vehicles while forcing car makers to produce EVs will eventually get to the point where EVs are cheaper. Um, that clearly is not working, but that's their theory of the case. But long term, if say Democrats get a significant several vote majority in the Senate and they control the House and they've got a Democratic president, they would like to pass a law to ban internal combustion engine vehicles. Like they're pretty open about that. They think that's the future.
In respect to charging stations, yeah, I know the federal government has talked about putting a lot of money toward that, billions of dollars in many instances, and there's only been a handful created in some cases. What's the status of charging stations around this country? Is it feasible to be able to travel around this country right now if a whole bunch of other people got electric vehicles?
Well, yeah, there's two parts to that. There's one, the infrastructure doesn't exist today. And part of that problem is that it costs money, especially fast charging, which is what you really need if you're trying to have people on a road trip come into a gas station and charge up and go. You need fast charging, and that's much more the infrastructure for that is much more expensive to install. Talk about rural areas like Wyoming. A rural gas station isn't necessarily going to have that you can't just take your current electric power line that you have hooked up to a gas station in the middle of nowhere and slap some fast chargers on that. You have to upgrade the power line too in order to have enough peak capacity to have 3 or 4 electric vehicles all fast charging at the same time. So there's a lot of infrastructure costs to that. And then when you talk about infrastructure, building anything in this country, you get the National Environmental Policy Act. There's regulatory issues that make building things harder. And that's why you're talking about the federal government has pledged tens of billions of dollars for electric vehicle charging stations, and barely anything's been built. We're now the infrastructure bill from the 2021 had double-digit billions committed for charging infrastructure, and only about 7 or 8 stations have actually gotten built and we're now 3 years later. And so it's not a question. Sometimes it's not even a question of money. The process of building takes too long. So you've got that infrastructure issue there. And then the point you're making about if everybody starts having electric vehicles, you already have issues now where electric vehicles at current penetration rates, people are waiting in line for chargers in order to charge. You talk about making every vehicle on the road, 300 million vehicles is going to be electric. The electricity capacity you need at charging stations, it's almost mind-boggling to try and calculate.
Now, Ford came out in the last couple days, 2 days or so, and they announced, I don't know if you've heard this, but they announced that between October 1st and January 2nd, they're going to be giving a level 2 charging station, and they'll be installing it into people's homes that buy their electrical vehicles. So I guess from that standpoint, they're kind of getting it. This is something that people aren't necessarily comfortable with, the charging stations. So let's try to make it easy on them. Have you heard that?
Yeah. I've actually, I think I've heard on the radio them advertising that deal. But yeah, and that's another thing. Even for people who have their own garage, have off-street parking of their own, you still to have a reason the level 2 charging, you still require some extra infrastructure in your home. You can plugging into just a wall socket, it'll take hours for your vehicle to charge. So yeah, that's fine for over if you're charging overnight. But say you have to do some errands in the morning and some errands in the afternoon. Like what? How do you refuel your vehicle in the middle of the day type of thing?
Right, exactly. And let's switch gears for a second, move away from vehicles. Let's talk about wind and solar when it comes to energy, to power houses and things like that. Especially out in the West, Texas, big states. We know in the past, for example, Texas had a problem with the wind turbines freezing and things like that. So, what are your thoughts and what is your analysis on the future of renewables when it comes to things like that instead of coal power plants, for example?
Right. Well, the fundamental problem for especially wind, but solar as well, is that it's intermittent, and we wealthy American humans don't use electricity intermittently. We use it when we need it. It's not just when the wind's blowing. Like we want to be able to wash our clothes or cook our food when we want to do it, not when the sun happens to be shining or the wind happens to be blowing. So, because they are intermittent, if you have to build so much extra infrastructure to even try and make it support a modern lifestyle. You have to overbuild the turbines and the solar panels themselves because you have to build them all over the place and hope that somewhere there's always some sun shining or some wind blowing, and you can hopefully move the electricity around to where the wind has stopped. That in theory. So you have to overbuild that. You have to build backup, and since they don't like coal and natural gas, they claim that batteries will be the backup to that, which that's trillions of dollars worth of battery backup. But batteries themselves are not enough backup because the batteries eventually run out. They don't produce electricity themselves. So you have to have the backup to the backup. And that ends up being natural gas almost always. Though sometimes it can be hydro depending on where you are in the country. In order to have a grid that is even, forget 100% wind and solar, because that's kind of far-fetched. But even if you're talking like maybe more than 50% wind and solar, you have to build the grid 3 or 4 times, like multiples of what you need in order to hope that you maintain reliability. And then even then, and that's just to maintain day-to-day reliability here too. We're not even talking about emergencies. We're not talking about hurricanes or wildfires or in the case of Texas, you talked about these extreme cold events that happen every 10 years or so that this last time, Winter Storm Uri, people died. This is the problem when all the electricity is out, people die. It's not like, if you can't drive your car, all right, that sucks, but you're not going to die. But when people lose electricity, people die.
If we can, let's talk about Europe for a second. I think it's Germany. Some of these countries that started to move toward renewables and realized that they were going down a dead end. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the big thing too is for lessons for us in the United States. The Europe should be a cautionary tale because a number of countries in Europe are much further along this arc into full getting as close to full wind and solar as possible. And if you look in Europe, the countries that have the highest percentage of wind generation also have the highest electricity rates. Talk about Germany, talk about Denmark, and these extremely high electricity rates. In the case of Germany, as you mentioned, Germany is going through essentially deindustrialization. The German companies are moving their factories from the country because the cost of energy has gotten so expensive. And that's a policy choice too. This was a deliberate choice to rely heavily on wind and to a lesser extent solar, even though Germany is one of the cloudiest countries in the world, but they also mandate solar. And meanwhile, they've been shutting down their nuclear plants and they've been trying to shut down coal plants, but of course, they have gotten to the point where, for reliability reasons, they are keeping coal plants open because ultimately, in a democratic society, people want to be able to turn the power on. And so, once these mandates start getting to the point where the power supply is threatened, then you have to have that reliable backup generation. And so, in Europe, some countries have gotten to the point where they can pretend that they're mostly renewables. Denmark is one that's especially um, claims that I think they claim there's something like 90% of their power comes from wind, some ridiculous percentage. But they're also connected into the wider grid. So when the wind's not blowing, they've got hydropower coming from Norway. They've got nuclear power coming from Sweden. They've got gas generation that's being generated in Central Europe. So they're not actually relying just on wind, just on renewables. It's a bit of a shell game here. The problem is, of course, is that if enough countries push far enough down this curve, there's no more shells left to move around. There's no backup reliable generation for you to rely on for imports. So it's truly it's a cautionary tale. The electricity prices in Europe are much higher than the United States. There's a reason why a lot of industrial investment. I'm personally from Texas, and in the last 10 years or so, because of cheap natural gas, you've seen huge industrial development along the Gulf Coast of Texas. But building factories and chemical plants and plastics processing facilities because energy is cheap, and that's jobs, that's a boost to the economy. And those plants are often leaving Europe, where electricity prices are sky high, and other energy prices too, natural gas as well. So it really it it's funny because the advocates of things like renewables, they say, well, look at Europe, things are going there, they produce so much more of their electricity from wind and solar. It's actually a cautionary tale. It's frankly it's bad. And on top of that, they have countries such like France, countries like Sweden that have a lot of nuclear generation, and that's sort of that nuclear generation, and also the hydro that Norway's big in hydro, and Switzerland has some hydro. That's kind of the backup. That base load is kind of what's still holding things together. But it's getting touch and go at points now. And going back to the electric vehicles point, um, what happens when there's running the risk of running out of electricity? You're told not to charge your electric vehicle. So
Right.
you are risking not having power, and you can't go anywhere. So you can't escape.
Yep, very good point. Especially let's say, for example, something like Helene happened, and you've got electric vehicle, and you're trying to get out of the southeast before the storm hits. What happens?
Yep. If you've lost power and again, I'm from Houston. We lose power when there's hurricanes, and the backup is diesel generators, and
Mhm.
people's vehicles being able to drive out of the disaster zone. And this is something that unfortunately is not really discussed very much when people talk about this transition, like electrify everything. Part of the benefit of having a transportation system that runs on something different than what's powering your home and heating your home is a little bit of redundancy there. Like you have a backup, you have an alternative. So if the grid goes down, you're not completely screwed.
Sure. Let me ask you this question, last question. So, where do you think in 10 years, just knowing what you know about energy research, in 10 years, where do you think we'll be when it comes to powering our vehicles and heating our houses? Is renewable going to still somehow be a portion of that mix? Are we just going to get fed up with it, or how do you think it's going to play out?
So renewables, meaning wind and solar, they're definitely in the mix, and especially solar. Actually, solar, I separate solar from wind when I'm discussing electricity issues, because solar actually does have some utility in certain parts of the country, particularly if you think about Arizona. The highest electricity demand periods in Arizona are during the hottest part of the day, during the summer, and that's also when solar panels produce the most electricity. So in a place like Arizona, Southern California, Texas, parts of the Southeast, solar can actually help meet that peak demand. Now, you can't run the entire grid on solar, but 10%, 20% of the grid on solar, you probably can get by with that. Wind is not particularly useful unless you're in one of the few states where the wind does really blow all the time. And those, of course, tend to not be where people live. Those are the more
Mhm.
sparsely populated states. So it's just you cannot run a modern grid on just wind and solar. You just can't. And the growth of those generation elements that we've seen in the last 10, 15 years, that's been the easy early penetration. Where things get hard is when you get to those higher penetrations and then you start having reliability issues. And I just, in a democratic society, we are not going to accept reliability failures in electricity. It's just not. It's when this is, I think as Roger Pilkey calls it, the iron law of energy discourse, is that people want the power on. So if there's a danger of the power going out, the policy is going to change. So ultimately, this forced attempted transition, it's going to push up against democratic realities. This is what's already happening in Europe. This is why you see a lot of their green mandates being rolled back. The current government in Germany it's a coalition government, and they've all been at each other's throats because no one wants the blame for the mandating heat pumps that they've been trying to do. It's extremely unpopular, and they're going to get voted out of office, and they're trying to blame each other for this unpopular mandate.
Mm-hmm.
So when push comes to shove, the politicians are going to back off. Let's just be realistic about it. But wind and solar are going to be a component of the electricity mix for sure. Electric vehicles are going to be a component of the vehicles market. But the question here is federal policy, is government coercion. Because in an organic market, I wouldn't expect wind and solar to exceed electricity generation of more than 20 to 30%, depending on where you are in the country. Like if we're really talking about lowest cost, most reliable, unsubsidized, and electric vehicles, maybe 20% of the market, 30% of the market, maybe, depending on how battery ranges improve and charging infrastructure gets built. You could see some percentages like that in an organic development. But the question here, the big variable, is government policy. In California, they're trying to ban internal combustion engines. If they're successful in doing that, well, then that's going to force the pace of electric vehicle usage. It seems like there's not that much democratic pushback in California on that, but at the federal level, there's definitely is democratic pushback. So that's the big variable. If government starts to get more aggressive, if you have a Democratic Party trifecta and they decide to go nuts and start mandating things and banning things, then maybe you see higher percentages because the government is forcing you. But that's not going to be organic, market driven. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I agree. And it's one of the things I think is kind of interesting is you've got gas powered vehicles, and you've got electric, and of course you've got hybrid right in the middle. I don't understand why hybrid didn't become more of a solution on the way to electric. It's almost like people just kind of took the dive, and for some people it's not working out so well.
Yeah, hybrids are great actually. And what's interesting is actually the most recent data I saw is about from the first 6 months of this year. As electric vehicle sales have been slowing, hybrid sales have actually continued to increase.
Yep.
So hybrids actually are the actual perfect combination of this, because you still have that gas backup if you're going a long distance, but for your shorter city commutes, you're running on battery. So, and it also not coincidentally, it's the most optimal use of minerals too. Instead of building this giant battery pack for an electric vehicle, you can have a small battery for a hybrid, and you use less material, but you still get the vast majority of the benefit you get from using electricity. So it's amazing, and it's frankly it's truly government policy, because in a free market competition, hybrids probably win, but this ideological project of electric vehicles are the future. They don't want hybrids because they don't want liquid fuels to exist at all for ideological reasons.
Yeah. I think you're right on that one. So if people want to find out more about your organization and the research you do, where do they go?
It's pretty easy, instituteforenergyresearch.org.
Fantastic. All right, Kenny, we appreciate your time today. And if people want to find out more about the Wyoming Liberty Group, just go to wyliberty.org. Thanks again, Kenny.
Thank you for having me.